John Carpenter's The Thing was a total disaster, and at the same time, one of the most terrifying horror movies ever made. A movie that's now considered a gold standard of the genre was completely destroyed by critics and audiences when it came out. But how did that happen? Well, to understand, let's take a closer look at the adaptations of this story. Hi, this is 11th Slate, and the ultimate history of The Thing. Almost 100 years ago in the 1930s, a young sci-fi writer named John W. Campbell Jr. created a story that would change both horror and science fiction forever. It would inspire countless imitators and practically invent its own subgenre, the hidden imposter among us theme. But it all began with a short story titled Brain Stealers from Mars. Yes, let's start there. Written in a light semi-comic tone, the author told the story of two space explorers fighting unknown organisms capable of mimicking any human and perfectly copying their behavior. The idea clearly deserved more than just a tongue-in-cheek sci-fi format. Following his editor's advice, Campbell reworked the concept, turning the light entertainment piece into a true science fiction horror story. In 1938, the novella Who Goes There was published, and it caused a small revolution. It would later inspire many legendary filmmakers, including John Carpenter himself. The story follows an Antarctic research team that discovers an alien creature frozen in ice for millions of years. The organism comes back to life and begins to multiply, taking on forms of any living being, from dogs to humans. Along with the appearance, it also inherits the victim's mannerisms, making it nearly impossible to tell who's human and who's the monster. The crew faces an impossible situation. No one can be trusted, and if the creature escapes the base, the entire world is doomed. Paranoia spreads, driving everyone to madness. The novella was heavily influenced by H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, published 2 years earlier. That story also involved an Antarctic expedition that unearthed the remains of an ancient civilization, with predictably disastrous results. Campbell borrowed the idea of a polar station as the perfect isolated setting for horror. At first, he even considered setting the Thing's attack in a small American town, but that scale would have been too epic. No one could realistically survive against such a being. And here's my favorite part. The idea of monsters wearing the faces of loved ones came from Campbell's own childhood. His mother had an identical twin, same appearance, completely different personality. The aunt despised both her sister and young John. Sometimes Campbell would come home, happily greet his mother, and instead get yelled at, only to realize later it had been his aunt. They say writers do best when they write what they know, and in a darkly poetic way, Campbell had first-hand experience with aggressors wearing familiar faces.
You gotta be f***ing kidding.
The novella was a massive success. It was reprinted multiple times over the years, and in 2014 it even received a retroactive Hugo Award, the top prize in sci-fi literature. Back in the 1930s, that award simply didn't exist. But just like the alien it describes, Who Goes There was frozen for decades, only to thaw out in modern times and start evolving again. What do I mean by that? We'll get there soon. But for now, it's time to move on to the cinema. Sooner or later, stories this big make their way to the screen. That's exactly what happened in the early 1950s. The film The Thing from Another World came out. The project caught the interest of the renowned director Howard Hawks, the man behind the original Scarface. Not the one about Tony Montana, but the other Tony from Italy, His Girl Friday, The Big Sleep, and many other famous classics of Hollywood's golden age. He took the role of producer for himself and appointed Christian Nyby, who had edited many of his films, as the director. Though to this day, film enthusiasts still argue about who exactly was the real driving force behind the creation of this cult horror film. The Thing from Another World looks far too much like Hawks' work, and has little in common with the films Nyby would make later. Though it's perfectly logical that, after editing so many of Hawks' movies, he would absorb his mentor's style. But some actors who worked on the classic Thing pointed out that Hawks spent all his time on set, and directed far more than producers usually do. So, to be safe, we'll list both men, Christian Nyby and Howard Hawks, as the directors. As the story moved to the big screen, the original was changed dramatically and looks very different from John Carpenter's 1982 film. First, the setting changed. The events moved from the South Pole, basically another planet nearly impossible to reach, to the North Pole.
A being from another world, as different from us as one pole from the other.
It's easier for the alien to get to civilization, and the film's actual main characters can reach the polar station more easily. For a story about fighting a dangerous alien, a group of hesitant scientists didn't look Hollywood enough. So instead of scholars studying the frozen creature, a squad of brave military men heads out to examine it. And at the station begins the classic clash between straightforward Air Force soldiers who want to destroy the creature and scientists who want to study the unknown organism.
There are no enemies in science, Professor. Only phenomena to study.
Also, for a more appealing Hollywood picture, the number of people at the outpost was increased by adding several female characters. Editors once hinted to John Campbell, the author of the original story, that a couple of women wouldn't hurt, but he simply couldn't fit them into a team of Antarctic researchers in the late 1930s. Back then, that would have looked even more fantastic than a shape-shifting alien. But once the plot gained a potential love interest for the main character, it became easy for the audience to pinpoint the imposter in the story.
Never mind. We don't have time for that now anyway.
The romantic subplot gets lost in the tension of the fight with the Thing. Alright, time to move on to the biggest change, the appearance of the alien itself. In the book, it was described as having 3 glowing red eyes and, instead of hair, thin tendrils. As we'll learn later, that wasn't the Thing's original form, but an unlucky alien the organism had absorbed on another planet. So, what does the 1951 film give us? Well, something like a Frankenstein monster. He's played by actor James Arness, chosen for his enormous height and broad frame. The second candidate for the role was John Dierkes. Here he is as one of the scientists. He had the height, but he was too thin, so he ended up playing a background researcher with no major role. Among the scientists, the only one worth noting is Robert Cornthwaite, obsessed with creating new versions of the Thing. Here you can see him doing that in this scene. And you might be wondering, what do the flowers have to do with anything? Well, the Thing from another world turned out to be plant-based and reproduces by seeds. The adaptation completely abandoned the central engine of the original novella. The alien doesn't change shape and always appears as a Boris Karloff cosplayer. That's the actor who played the most famous version of Frankenstein's monster. Regularly changing its form would have required additional special effects, and that meant extra budget. The film already cost over $1 million. If we adjust for inflation, today that's the equivalent to roughly $13.5 million. Not exactly cheap cinema. At first, the movie follows the novella fairly closely. Aside from the uninvited military, there's the attempt to extract the alien ship, which ends with its destruction. The slow thawing of the monster while the guard isn't looking, even the dog attack. But otherwise, this is a very different work, not much like the original. After several encounters with a creature, the heroes incinerate it with an electrical trap. And that's it. No paranoia, no test to identify imposters. Just a monster movie showdown on an unusual location. The film ends with the famous warning shouted by a journalist who ended up at the pole by accident.
Watch the skies. Everywhere. Keep looking. Keep watching the skies.
And in that line, you can find one of the major reasons for the success of The Thing from Another World. The film was well received. More than that, it became a milestone in screen science fiction, even though it completely removed the shape-shifting villain. A huge factor here is the era in which it was released. The early 1950s were the height of UFO hysteria. Just a few years earlier, in 1947, a flying saucer had crashed in Roswell, New Mexico, or so the public believed. Some object had crashed near a military base, and a careless press release mentioned a flying disc. The public needed nothing more. Everyone became obsessed with UFOs, and the government's desperate attempts to convince the population that no little gray men existed only made people more suspicious. So, alien-themed films became wildly popular, and the final warning from the classic Thing, "Watch the skies," was seen almost as prophecy. Today you can argue endlessly about whether it's a good film, whether it's scary enough, whether the story works without the paranoia element. But the important thing is that in 1951, the Thing began spreading through pop culture and nothing could stop it. Jack Finney wrote his famous Invasion of the Body Snatchers about sinister aliens pretending to be normal humans. Countless sci-fi legends like Robert Sheckley and Philip K. Dick also produce stories about aliens who can change their appearance. But the true cinematic phenomenon of The Thing was still decades away, though that doesn't mean cinema left the idea alone. How about a story where Count Dooku and Grand Moff Tarkin fight the Thing in Siberia? Yeah, that happened too. In 1972, Horror Express was released, a low-budget Spanish horror movie starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, directed by Eugenio Martin. There was a period when Spain and Italy were flooding theaters with tons of this kind of not always high-quality stuff, featuring well-known actors in lead roles. Even though the movie never directly stated that it was inspired by Campbell's novella, I think it's pretty obvious. Let's look at the setup. In the early 20th century, scientist Alexander Saxton discovers a body frozen in the ice, supposedly a prehistoric human, although an extremely ugly one. He loads the crate with his find onto a train traveling along the Trans-Siberian Railway. The alien, and by the end it turns out this really is a visitor from another galaxy, thaws out and starts killing passengers. A typical monster movie, but with one important detail. The monster can take over other people's bodies, hide among the crowd, and even steal its victims' memories, very close to The Thing, just on a train. Why a train? Let's not forget the film was low budget, meaning it was shot under very limited conditions. There's a good chance that if not for a happy coincidence, the characters would have been running from the creature through a bare-bones setting, like a mansion or the dark hallways of a research lab. But producer Bernard Gordon got the opportunity to shoot using the excellent train set left over from a large British epic, Nicholas and Alexandra, about the Russian emperor and his wife. So the script was written around the train, and the foundation was built on another already classic John Campbell plot, no doubt about that. You can also spot actor Telly Savalas. He played Blofeld in the Bond film with George Lazenby, here playing a Cossack named Kazan.
I'll have you sent to Siberia.
I am in Siberia.
The movie is simple but entertaining. With a budget of $300,000, it earned a decent box office. It didn't leave a mark on film history and wasn't meant to. Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing finished shooting and went on to expand their already massive filmographies. In 1972 alone, besides Horror Express, they had 3 more films released. And in one of them, they appeared together again. Lee played Dracula, and Cushing played Von Helsing. Horror Express clearly shows that the story framework created by John Campbell had become a classic template for similar works. But the most important part is what came next. In 1978, John Carpenter released Halloween, which kicked off the long journey of the iconic villain Michael Myers. In one scene, the characters are watching The Thing from Another World on TV, one of the director's all-time favorite films. Carpenter was practically teasing his own future project, or, to be more precise, hinting to the studios that he really wanted to make this movie. In 1982, The Thing starring Kurt Russell was released. A film that would conquer millions, revolutionize the use of special effects, and flop at the box office, trashed by many critics and even Christian Nyby, the director of the previous adaptation. And of course, The Thing sparked endless debates about which of the survivors at the end of the movie was the alien. Or were they both aliens? We're about to find the answers together. In the meantime, support the video with a like if you enjoy these deep dives into cinema. The idea to make a new The Thing appeared back in the 1970s. The producers thought about making a new adaptation of Campbell's novella closer to the original, that is, to add paranoia to the battle with the monster, the search for those infected by a mysterious cosmic creature. After several unsuccessful attempts to launch production by various studios, the rights to The Thing ended up in the hands of Universal, who immediately entrusted the work on the new adaptation to a young, talented director, Tobe Hooper, who had torn up the film industry with the extremely unsettling Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But then the production stopped. The producers never heard a workable concept for the new The Thing. Hooper wanted to turn this story into something like a new Moby Dick, about a harsh captain going in search of a monster. And the original novella seemed boring to the director, and he didn't plan to do a direct adaptation of it. Then the producers sighed with relief and said they had avoided the appearance of one of the worst films in history. All this time, another newcomer to the film industry was hovering nearby, John Carpenter, dreaming of making this picture. He had been a fan of the 1951 adaptation since childhood, and was eager to bring his favorite 10 story into a new cinema era. But he was a beginning author of art house action movies and sci-fi comedies, and The Thing was planned as a big studio project. He hadn't grown up to it yet. However, at the end of the 1970s, two films came out that changed the studio's minds. First, John Carpenter's Halloween. The slasher about Michael Myers came out in 1978 and earned $70 million with a budget of a few $100,000. Turns out Carpenter can be profitable. And a year later, the first Alien by Ridley Scott comes out, confirming the public's interest in space monsters and sealed-off thrillers. It was time to launch The Thing into production and fulfill John Carpenter's long-standing dream. Besides, after Halloween, he shot two more pictures, The Fog and Escape from New York, which did very well at the box office. Since the director had not had a single box office failure, that means this time everything will be great, right? Well, sometimes life brings a bunch of surprises. The plot of the new Thing was brought as close as possible to the original novella. The setting was returned to the South Pole, though they shot, of course, much farther north, in Alaska and in snowy regions of Canada, not counting the shooting in the Los Angeles studio. The number of polar researchers was reduced, though. In the novella, there were 37, too many for a film in which it's desirable to develop as many characters as possible. Now the Antarctic expedition consists of 12 people. There is a hidden meaning in this number, and no, it's not about the number of apostles. Exactly 12 people make up a jury, and that is exactly what the characters will be doing, judging each other, whether the one in front of them is a human or a cosmic creature.
I'd rather not spend the rest of this winter tied to this fucking couch!
As for developing the heroes, The Thing deserves all praise. The characters' traits are revealed in a couple of scenes, and the viewer perfectly understands who is who. Just look at how the dog handler Clark rushes at the colleague to protect the dogs. People clearly interest him less than cute animals. Or the expedition leader who doesn't rush to save his comrades, but breaks a window in order to take a shot from a safe position. He's thoughtful and cautious. Some of the heroes' names migrated from the novella. The dog handler Clark, the expedition leader Gary, the gradually losing it Blair, and of course the main hero, Macready, turned from a meteorologist into a tough helicopter pilot with a military past. The tendency toward more combative heroes is still in place, and in the very first scene, he burns a computer after losing at chess. This person will not put up with defeat, even if he loses valuable equipment. He's played by Kurt Russell, who before that had worked twice with John Carpenter. Another important member of the crew was cinematographer Dean Cundy, who had shot 3 of the director's pictures before that. The Thing is famous for ideal camera work, which in many ways tells the story even better than it's conveyed through dialogue. I'll show that soon with concrete examples. For the beginning of this film, Carpenter took the idea of the author of the original novella, John Campbell. A long exposition really hurts the picture. Scientists find a flying saucer, transport the alien's body, it slowly thaws. Why all of this? The novella begins already at the station with the retrieved alien, and the story of the find is given through a small flashback. Moreover, Campbell wrote 3 entire chapters describing the discovery in detail, but they were mercilessly cut in order to start the novella at the needed point. Same in the film. A dog runs through the snow while people in a helicopter try to shoot it. The viewer is intrigued and has no idea what's going on, unless of course you speak Norwegian, because the dog's pursuer lays out all the plot twists in that scene. The moment was intentionally shown without subtitles so that viewers would keep guessing what's happening. And here we meet one of the best actors of this film, the dog, Jed, in whose form the Thing gets to the station of the main heroes. Seriously, just look at how calm and intelligent this creature is, studying the new environment as if it's listening to those around it. At this moment, the monster infects the first member of the expedition. We don't see who it is, only a curly silhouette. The viewer is supposed to start guessing who became the first victim. It turns out the infected one was Michael Myers. To add doubts for the public, John Carpenter didn't put a real actor in the frame, and apparently this is Charles Hallahan, who plays Norris. He looks most like the silhouette and will be the first to show his alien nature. The director used stuntman Dick Warlock in that scene, who had previously played Michael Myers in the second Halloween. So, how exactly does the Thing infect everyone? Each of its cells is essentially an independent organism, and on contact with any particle of the monster, the copying process begins. One condition: the victim must be alive. Realizing this, the heroes exclude the use of shared cutlery and any interactions. Determining who exactly has become a monster in human guise is not so simple. In the original novella, the heroes try to create a special serum showing whether the blood in front of them is human. Its creation takes several days, but without result, because an infected person participated in producing it. In the end, the method is found. Since each piece of the creature becomes an independent organism, even a drop of blood will have a self-preservation instinct, meaning that if you threaten the taken sample, for example with a red-hot wire, it will fight back.
We'll do you last.
The human test scene came from the novella and is perhaps the most atmospheric moment of the picture. And the cinematographer Dean Cundey left in the scene a clue indicating who here is actually human. Pay attention to the subject's eyes. If you can see a glint in them, then in front of us is a human, if not an alien monster. This is a human, this too. But the character named Palmer is definitely not from our planet. One of the most important tasks of the film was to understand what the thing should look like. The look from the previous 1951 adaptation didn't fit here. Carpenter really wanted to move away from the concept of a man in a rubber suit. Then the special effects master Rob Bottin proposed an unusual and very bold idea. The monster should not have a definite form. This organism traveled the universe and encountered a huge number of creatures. A piece of different species that it assimilated stayed in it. Therefore, the thing is a clump of fangs, tentacles, and spider-like limbs. With each contact, it adds a new detail to its appearance. A dog's head or the face of its victim. This is really the thing. It's hard to characterize this creature somehow. Although if you look at how these effects were made, everything turns out simple. Just improvised ingredients.
You know what that is?
What?
Melted plastic and microwave bubblegum.
No way. Really?
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Rob Bottin, who was only 22 during the making of the picture, was not the only special effects master. The dog infection scene was created by the stop-motion genius Phil Tippett. By the time the thing came out, he had already worked on 2 parts of Star Wars and was considered a master of his craft. Later, he would be responsible for the great visuals of RoboCop, Starship Troopers, and Jurassic Park. For the last one, he would even get a deserved Oscar. The unique look of the thing was not the only challenge for the crew. John Carpenter, in pursuit of uniqueness, had to adjust the initial script. It had too many classic horror devices. Sudden screams, bodies falling from off-screen, and so on. One of the heroes was supposed to be pinned to a door with a shovel, and that scene was even shot. The footage can be found on the internet, but Carpenter wanted something completely different. An atypical horror based on paranoia and suspicion of those around you. It's a real shame that this innovative idea would play against the picture. But more about that when we reach the reception right after the premiere. Having gotten rid of banal scares, the script became more interesting from the point of view of the story, but visually boring. Mostly it consisted of men talking in a room. Therefore, many scenes had to be moved outside, and the snow tinted with blue light, creating a feeling of extreme cold. And burning flares on a white snowy background look much more stylish than inside some warehouse walls. The heroes will regularly change locations, making the film more spectacular, and identify the monster among colleagues. I think it's time for us to do the same and trace who and when was infected. And most important, to understand who stayed alive in the final scene. I think it was Kurt Russell, but let's go in order. First, the dog infects a character named Norris in that very shadow scene. Before that, it tried to lick Bennings at the first meeting, but unsuccessfully. If you look closely, there was no contact with the tongue. That Norris is assimilated is clearly seen by his reaction right here. No fear at all. He felt the approach of his colleague in the form of a dog. Next, Palmer is infected. That guy. Most likely the monster got to him after separating from the dog and slipping out through the roof. Then comes Blair, played by Wilford Brimley. And I'm almost sure that contact happened right at this moment. He touches the body and then brings the stick to his mouth. Very careless to do when working with extraterrestrial organisms. But hey, hindsight is 20/20.
And in the process, shape its own cells to imitate them.
At the moment of watching the tape of the Norwegian expedition from which the dog ran, we already see the thing, not Blair. Pay attention that the people on the recording make a reference to the 1951 film when they measure the area of the flying saucer with their arms spread, exactly like the heroes from the first adaptation did. Yes, it turns out the Norwegians dug up a UFO, found the thing, but destroyed their outpost. transformed into a dog and ran further, escaping the survivors. We already know the outcome of this chase. Back to Blair. He calculates the speed of the planet's infection by the alien organism. This is needed not by the character, but by the alien itself, to assess the prospects of spread. Then, my favorite. Assimilated Blair pretends to go crazy and smashes the radio room. You might think it's to prevent the spread of infection and not call for help, but that's not it. The original novella helps us here. It emphasizes that if you stop making contact, a rescue expedition will arrive. The book's heroes, on the contrary, keep calling civilization on schedule and pretend everything is fine. The thing in Blair's body knows this and deliberately destroys the communications, so the rescuers will fly in and take the thing to a larger concentration of people, while the desperate polar researchers can't warn them about the shape-shifting monster. True, there is one moment that adds some doubt to this theory: this noose. As in the novella, Blair shows his violent character and ends up locked up. So, in one of the visits to this character, we see a noose near him, as if Blair got infected, realized it, and decided to secure the others by eliminating himself. But the alien assimilated him earlier, meaning the contact with the thing happened in the cell, which doesn't fit with the moment of practically licking alien DNA. So, most likely this is another distracting plan by the alien, which absorbed Blair's behavior and modeled the surroundings according to his character, and imitation goes to the maximum. Thus, the thing adopted not only Norris's appearance, but also his weak heart, which will lead to the memorable scene with the voracious chest. In reality, Blair really wanted to remain locked up to keep building a flying machine in the underground tunnel, a scene fully migrated from the source. Then comes Bennings, no surprises here. We were shown the moment of his assimilation, and then they even made a small reference to Invasion of the Body Snatchers. With the next character, everything is clear. Either they turn on screen or die without being assimilated. The only unclear thing is what happened with the cook, Knowles. The scene of his assimilation was cut from the film. They say that in his case the effects didn't work and the moment looked funny, so Knowles' death was cut. And now we come to the main thing. The thing is destroyed, and only McReady remains alive. And suddenly, Childs appears, played by actor Keith David in his first major film role. The survivors slowly freeze, satisfied with their feat and the salvation of mankind, or not. The ending of The Thing is one of the most discussed finales in cinema history. Millions of messages on forums and hundreds of video essays. If Childs survived, why does disturbing music start playing at this moment? And why does MacReady smile meaningfully? Oh, right, music. For the first time in John Carpenter's filmography, the soundtrack was written not by him, but by the legendary Ennio Morricone. And what's the most brain-melting is that for the melodies to The Thing, he was nominated for a Golden Raspberry in the category Worst Music. Twice. Morricone was also embarrassed for another picture, Butterfly. And years later, unused music from The Thing, very similar in tone to it, was taken into the soundtrack of Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight and received an Oscar. Award paths are mysterious. Also, if you missed the previous episodes, there are already videos on the channel about Back to the Future, as well as the Alien and Predator universes and their evolution, or maybe their decline. You will find the answer in those videos. Back to the finale. The viewers found a million confirmations for all sorts of theories. Both are human and heroically die, or both are infected and deliberately sat farther from the fire to freeze, and in that state get to the mainland. They celebrate victory over the polar researchers. There's also this. Childs is the Thing, and MacReady understood it, hence the bitter grin, realizing the fight isn't over. Or maybe the opposite. MacReady was infected from the very beginning, eliminating all the humans by a great bluff, and by destroying pieces of his own body like predators biting off a paw caught in a trap. And he passed the blood test easily. He set it up himself, meaning he could swap the blood. In the end, MacReady hands Childs a bottle with his saliva and infects the last survivor. Total success. There's also an answer to the torn clothing of Russell's character. It's not sabotage by the Thing, but real remnants of his outfit torn during assimilation. The theory is no worse than others. John Carpenter, like the rest of the crew, smiles meaningfully and offers different versions of the ending. And sometimes the director even contradicts himself. Once online, he answered that one of the survivors is definitely the Thing. He says the same in the Blu-ray commentary, only he doesn't remember which one. Sure, we believe that. And then the video game was released, and in that, it's too early for that. We'll get there soon. So, in my view, the situation is this. Blair definitely assimilated Childs. Right here, he is guarding the door, and behind his back hangs a blue jacket, just like the one he wears. And then we see a long camera glide, and the room is already empty, and that very jacket has vanished from the hanger. Notice how Dean Cundy, with only the image, tells the story of Child's death. Blair was hiding underground. So first we see the door to the basement. From there, the Thing began its path to the unsuspecting character. On the right is a utility room. That's where the monster went in. Then a bit further. Here the utility door is open. The Thing crept up to Childs from behind, assimilated him, traditionally tearing his clothes, put on the blue parka to resemble the hero, and went to look for the survivors. And in the final dialogue, you can see at least 2 visual hints. Remember the eye glint of which viewers are hinted at who is infected? Macready has a light in his eyes. Childs doesn't. If anything, these are the cinematographer's own words, so no guesswork. The next hint is breath vapor. Macready is distinct, and Childs seems not to be breathing, though I'd skip that hint. First, Child's vapor is noticeable at the start. And second, if the Thing could copy Norris's bad heart, then its lungs surely work too. Many look for meaning in the past bottle, as if Macready understood everything in that moment. The first version, it's not whiskey but a bottle of gasoline left after burning the base. Childs didn't notice, therefore he's an alien. Though again, the Thing copies the victim down to every cell. So it surely adopts such little things as taste receptors, right? And Russell's hero was ready to take a sip, even before the colleague appeared. The second version, Macready noticed that Childs calmly took the bottle from his hands, though earlier the Polar researchers strictly refused close contacts. Sounds logical, but everything is much simpler. Macready never stopped suspecting anyone. He doesn't need to give the alien gasoline to realize this. Childs' very first phrase sounds like,
"You the only one who made it?"
He doesn't view himself as a survivor. And a couple of lines later, Macready and Thing Childs realizes pretending is pointless, and start talking like an extraterrestrial species with a human. Just listen to these lines and imagine that the heroes know the whole truth about each other.
How will we make it?
Maybe we should. If we've got any surprises for each other.
This is a brief truce of 2 exhausted beings who put hostility on pause, but are waiting for a moment to continue the fight. I see this ending exactly that way. The Thing doesn't know how to behave with Macready for one reason. Pay attention where Russell's hero lived, in a separate room away from the rest of the scientists, while the evil dog managed to study all the other expedition members under the ping pong table. Macready is a riddle for the monster, its main opponent, and here the battle does not end. The on-screen alien did not copy one more of its features from the original. It cannot read minds and communicate telepathically, as it did in the novella. There, the creature was even more dangerous and could crawl into people's heads and also send prophetic dreams. Without such abilities, it cannot understand Macready, but the most likely version of the finale is this. What difference does it make? The authors themselves don't know. And why should they? Open endings annoy the public, but they can become the cause of immortality for many pictures. The discussion of the Thing's ending is a very important moment of pop cultural analysis of a beloved film by the masses, like the ending of The Sopranos or the spinning top in Christopher Nolan's Inception. It's a subject for discussion, and that's already a plus for the picture. But at the time of release, it didn't work, and man did it bomb. To say that the Thing was received coolly is equivalent to silence. Critics were irritated with the picture. They called it trash, an idol of mindless violence, and Carpenter himself a pornographer. They said the heroes are nothing. There are no normal scares, only blood, blood, and blood for a multi-million budget. And the ending is pure gloom, depressing and unclear. So, who won? Do we go to the cinema to think? In the end, with a huge $14 million budget, The Thing earned about $20 million in theaters. Seriously, even a film titled The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas grossed 4 times more that year than The Thing. Just listen to it. The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. definitely a selling title. John Carpenter always treated scathing reviews sensitively, but in the case of this picture, he got a punch in the gut. The director of the 1951 The Thing from Another World, Christian Nyby, watched the new adaptation and smashed it to pieces. He said, "If you want blood, it's easier to go to a slaughterhouse. There's nothing here besides advertising for J&B Scotch." Well, to be fair, bottles of that drink do indeed often appear in the frame. This film became an important milestone in Carpenter's career. If it had been a success, his professional path would have gone in a completely different direction, and we would have seen totally different movies. But after the failure, everything began to fall apart. Carpenter was fired from his next picture. He was supposed to direct Firestarter with Drew Barrymore. The director had to start his path almost from scratch, all because of one failure. In 1982, people wanted to watch more life-affirming stories, not bathe in gloom with an unclear and very oppressive ending. In any case, everyone will die. What a nightmare. The box office hit was Spielberg's E.T. Those aliens are better and clearer. And he even flies home. How delightful. Other movies that came out that year were Tootsie, Poltergeist, and Rocky III. Everything is sweet and inspiring. Though the first Rambo also made a lot of money, but let's call that an exception. It's even more funny than the cult classic The Thing came out on the same day as another nightmarish box office flop, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. It's morally hard for me to use the word flop next to such legendary films, but that's business. That year, the audience clearly preferred relaxation to tragedy, but once The Thing came out on VHS, everything changed. The film became an unexpected hit on home media. Every year it became more popular, and now it's a genre legend. Roughly the same thing happened with Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. In the moment, they spat on it, but in history, they rewarded it with an ovation. The films just came out earlier than they needed to. These movies were ahead of their time. The debates about The Thing's ending continued, and the next couple of decades, we would get several versions of further events. True, not in cinema, but in comics and a video game. At the end of 1991, the first comic book sequel to The Thing was released by Dark Horse. The story takes place a day after the ending of the film. Childs turned out to be human and pulled MacReady out onto the ice, where an icebreaker picked him up. His path leads him to an Argentine research camp, where he ends up in a battle with the remaining pieces of the creature, and it all ends on a submarine. Kurt Russell's character survives again, while Childs goes down with the monster. The story doesn't add anything new, but it's valuable because it draws a line under the debates about the movie's finale. Both characters turned out to be human, which didn't stop the creature from reassembling itself from other leftover fragments. It can't stop an epidemic with a simple fire. But The Thing isn't done with MacReady that easily. In the next comic series, he's picked up by Argentine soldiers and taken to their base in Tierra del Fuego. That is, right here at the southern tip of South America. We haven't yet seen what this creature can do in the jungle. MacReady beats everyone again, but loses Childs for good this time. He comes back fully assimilated. It seems like a final victory, but Dark Horse won't stop. A third series comes out, and this time set on a small island near New Zealand. The Thing arrives there in the form of a fish. Yeah, that's where I have a hard time believing any of this. Once in the water, the Thing could easily infect absolutely all marine life and then move on to humans. But here it's different. For some reason, the monster decides to immediately terrorize the bipeds with no preparation at all. Omnipresent MacReady arrives at the island and witnesses the destruction of a small town. I still seriously doubt that such a powerful creature could ever be defeated if it spread like this. That's why the authors always release it at the poles. It's impossible to prevent its spread once it gets beyond a small group of polar researchers. The story is worth praising for its pretty interesting depiction of communication inside the creature's collective consciousness. It really shows the conflict from a new angle. Meanwhile, John Carpenter said in an interview that he isn't thinking about making a sequel to The Thing, but if he ever did, it would be based on the stories in these comics. Not a bad compliment from a master. And there's another alternate comic continuation published in a Dark Horse anthology. Scientists arrive at the burned-down Antarctic station, take a piece of the Thing with them for research, and of course die. That's the result of questionable experiments. Fittingly, the story is called Questionable Research. In the finale, the scientist ship is destroyed and the Thing, now in the form of a seagull, flies off to warmer places. After that comes nothing but the inevitable end of the world. For almost a decade, the franchise fell silent, while getting well-deserved nods from new massively popular projects. For example, the famous X-Files episode called Ice, about Mulder and Scully in a remote research station in Alaska, and a mysterious parasite pulled from the ice after hundreds of thousands of years that infects people. Or a Star Trek episode about an isolated station and shape-shifting aliens. The influence of this story on pop culture is undeniable. The Thing returned in 2002 as a video game continuing the events of the film. The player takes on the role of Captain Blake, the head of a special forces team sent to investigate what happened to the Antarctic base. The task is to survive the cold, burn aliens with a flamethrower, and foil the plans of Mad Colonel Whitley, who voluntarily injected himself with the Thing's gene. According to him, it made the creature controllable, but we know better. According to the video game, Childs was human and froze near the ruined station, and MacReady survived and even saves the game's protagonist in the finale.
So what's your name, smartass? MacReady.
The funniest part is that John Carpenter said the video game is canon, although later he said that one or two of the survivors in the film's ending was definitely the Thing. Just admit it already, he has no idea. Almost a decade later, the popular sci-fi writer Peter Watts published the short story The Things. Its main twist is that it's written from the creature's point of view. The story reveals the monster's plans, its unity, and its supposed salvation of all organisms on Earth, its fear of MacReady, and yet another version of who was assimilated and when. Supposedly, Childs was infected long before the scene with the guarded door, just like Dr. Cooper, who was killed by Norris's chest mouth as a distraction. Another confirmation that everyone has their own version of the ending, and it's probably valid. But what about the movies? In the 2000s, the era of remakes and long-delayed sequels began. Anything that flopped on release but later became a cult classic eventually gets another chance. And The Thing was no exception. In 2011, almost 30 years later, a long-awaited new film was released, which unexpectedly turned out to be a prequel, and introduced several new rules for fighting the creature. At first, The Thing was planned to be made in the format of a TV series on the Sci-Fi Channel, and it was being developed by Frank Darabont himself, the director of The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. The plot was supposed to tell about a Russian expedition that finds the frozen Childs and MacReady, takes the remaining pieces of The Thing, and everything starts all over again. Then a flash forward a couple of decades ahead, and another outbreak begins in a small town in New Mexico. But the series never went into production. Universal Studios placed their bet on a feature film. The development was assigned to producers Mark Abraham and Eric Newman, who had worked on Zack Snyder's remake of Dawn of the Dead, meaning they understood remakes well. After all, the zombie movie performed well at the box office. Except the producers didn't want to redo The Thing. They said Carpenter's film was so perfect that remaking it would be like drawing a mustache on the Mona Lisa. Instead, another option was proposed. A prequel about the fate of the Norwegian expedition. Yes, the very one that will perish. The surviving Norwegians will chase the Thing dog and also die because of the language barrier. In fact, you could make a decent atmospheric tragedy from this with a very bleak ending. Screenwriter Ronald D. Moore wrote a script that was later rewritten by another writer, Eric Heiserer. The first draft completely excluded the character's paranoia and any type of detective-style line. It turned into a straightforward horror movie, but the producers wanted to make it like back then. A newcomer, Matthijs van Heiningen Jr., who had previously mostly worked on commercials, was appointed as director. The main thing is that he's a fan of Carpenter's film, which means he would approach the work with love. Unfortunately, that would not be enough, because the goal of the director is not to make a good movie, but to satisfy the producer's vision, right? According to the producers, exactly. We'll get more into this vivid example of unprofessionalism. So, the plot. Everything begins almost like in the novella. The Norwegians find a frozen spaceship in the ice and the remains of an alien creature. For authenticity, they cast real Scandinavian actors with a small mix of Hollywood stars. To study the alien, paleontologist Kate Lloyd, played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead, is invited to the Antarctic base. The screenwriter immediately wanted to fix the gender imbalance of the previous adaptation and make a woman the main character, to create a new Ellen Ripley from Alien, only for the confrontation with the Thing. The monster breaks free and the classic Among Us begins. Attempts to find the imposter among the Compared to the novella and Carpenter's film, the prequel of The Thing takes a very long time to get going and spends a lot of time on exposition. It needs to state all the essential details for those who forgot the original or never saw it. But all this is easy to forgive because soon the vicious alien will break out and start its terrifying rampage. The design of The Thing is so horrific that it can work well on viewers of any generation, and that moment has come. Wait, what was that? All appearances of the monster will be presented in the form of far from convincing CGI? But how could a person who loves the original, that is, the director, allow this? And here is the first example of the studio's unprofessionalism. For the prequel of The Thing, full animatronic models were created, and the entire film was shot using them to match Carpenter's atmosphere. But someone in a focus group said that the film looks like it's from the 80s, and this greatly worried the producers. They wanted groundbreaking box office numbers, so they demanded that all scenes with animatronics be replaced with CGI. So instead of a soulful, practical creature, we get a textured face on one of the monsters. Later, the special effects artist, whose entire work was cut from the prequel, would raise money on Kickstarter to finally show it to the public. It resulted in the film Harbinger Down, very similar to The Thing. The same shape-shifting monsters, only on a ship. And although the animatronics there aren't perfect, they are still better than this. Only one scene turned out flawless, the one with Adam's absorption and the appearance of that very two-headed monster that the heroes of the original film would find among the ruins of the Norwegian base. To emphasize the connection with the previous movie, the creators tried to recreate the station's interior shot for shot. Remember how MacReady and Norris found an axe sticking out of the door? Now we learn what exactly happened at that moment. And of course, how could they do without their own version of MacReady? The new cool pilot is played by Joel Edgerton, but don't think he's the main character. Kate is the one leading everything. She will also come up with a new way to detect assimilated people. The Thing can only reproduce organic matter. This means metal pins and dental crowns won't attach to its new body. Of course, this method doesn't account for healthy teeth or porcelain, but it's something. Then, wait. Childs had an earring in his ear. Does that mean he's human? Nah. The ending of the prequel will show us why the creature noticed the ear piercing and put it on itself after taking Child's body. The aliens won't delay long and will pounce on the heroes very aggressively. Yes, the Thing became more mobile and loves to run around in its non-human shape, which became so ordinary that it doesn't cause any tension. Again, except for Adam's death. That was creepy. In the original, MacReady found a guy who decided to deal with everything before the monster got to him. Turns out his name was Colin, but his death scene is not in the film, only in the bonus materials. In the end, Mary Elizabeth Winstead will kill the Thing in the form of Edgerton, identifying him by the earring in the wrong ear.
You know how I knew you were human? Your earring.
This mistake would later teach the assimilated Childs. And imagine, Kate survives. She goes to a nearby Russian base. And ironically, the other survivor is Lars, the only member of the expedition who doesn't speak English. We know his fate from the original. The helicopter pilot is completely unaware of what's happening and arrives at the base at the last moment. Despite obvious shortcomings, the prequel version of The Thing is quite a decent bridge to Carpenter's film, and repeating the fate of its predecessor, it will bomb at the box office, earning $31 million with a budget of $38. Replacing animatronics with CGI significantly increased the cost, and the producers kept forcing reshoots because they didn't like the pacing of early cuts. One scene was reshot 2 weeks before the release and finished in a hurry. The production was so toxic and dependent on producer whims that director Matthijs van Heiningen decided never to make movies again. A decade later, he thawed, but swore off working with Hollywood studios. The fear of failure doomed the prequel Thing to failure. Such cruel irony. The franchise was shelved, even though it clearly had plans. A comic series came out about the Thing fighting Vikings. Sure, why not? There were talks about the next step in Kate's story, this time on an oil platform. But after the box office failure, these plans were forgotten instantly. The Thing, just like the nasty creature itself, went into a long hibernation. It was frozen. And by the way, very soon on the channel there will be a full deep dive into Evil Dead. a franchise that did not start out as a major success, and its long journey to where it is now, a journey that is still not over. But in 2018, a very unexpected and symbolic discovery happened. In the Harvard archive, they found the full version of the novella, Who Goes There?, by the same John Campbell, in the form of the novel titled Frozen Hell. It includes a long exposition, several additional scenes, but overall follows the structure of the original. I don't know how many more allusions to the Thing this franchise can give us. While movies about shape-shifting aliens are frozen in the icy hearts of studio executives, in the depths of libraries another form of this story was found, thawed and published, which renewed interest in the work. Suddenly, the 2002 video game received a remaster. Now, Blumhouse Studios, together with Universal, are developing a new version of this story. According to producers, it will combine The Thing from Another World, Carpenter's film, and the newly found Frozen Hell. And who knows, maybe this time the series will manage not only to be a cult film, but also receive recognition at release. The Thing from Another World was very important for the development of science fiction as a whole. Carpenter's Thing was too bold and unusual for its time, but won the hearts of fans years later. The Sabotage prequel can also be watched without disgust, only occasional wincing at awful CGI. And the novella Who Goes There? Is one of the most important works in the genre, inspiring thousands of authors and creating a new direction, horror detective about hunting shapeshifters with human appearance. We wait for the next coming of The Thing, and I will definitely return to this unique series in future videos. The next video is already on the screen. Click it and keep watching. Thanks for your time. This is 11 Slate.